back. We're talking about policing in America and the challenges of training and building a racially diverse force reflective of the community it serves. Joining us from Los Angeles is that city's former police chief and current city councilman, Bernard Parks. With us from Florida is retired police officer and associate professor at Florida Gulf University, David Thomas. Here in Washington is journalist and commentator Roland Martin. Also with us from Los Angeles is civil rights attorney and activist Connie Rice. Connie, let's look at what is being done, or what the administration here is trying to do to fix this problem. You were a member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Among the recommendations were building trust and legitimacy with the community and improved training and education. There were other recommendations that the committee made as well. But how does one go about trying to achieve those goals? I mean, are they being implemented, the recommendations that you made?
I think they're beginning to look at how to do that. What the federal government can do is provide funds for local police departments to undertake this training and to hire the expertise they need. It's really a revolution in policing because it's very different to start out as a cop and say, my goal is to make as many arrests, issue as many tickets, and be as aggressive and warrior-like as possible, versus I am going to become a member of this community. I'm going to know everybody's name. I'm going to stay long enough to learn the community, and I'm going to serve this community and earn their trust. Very, very different outlooks. And to retrain, we don't have the curriculum yet to do that. In LA, at LAPD right now, where we have a unit, a specialized unit called the Community Safety Partnership Police, that do that kind of policing, the trust policing. But the rest of the force is still doing the old style of hunt and search and destroy.
Chief Parks, we often forget, we always see you as, the former chief of police of Los Angeles, now a councilman, but we often forget the fact that you joined right at the bottom rung and you worked your way up to become commissioner of what is arguably one of the best known police forces in the country, if not the world. But you yourself experienced a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination while you were serving in the police force. Tell us about your experience there.
Well, one thing I think that's important to realize is that police departments are just like the communities they come from. So to believe that you have a police department of 9,000, 10,000 people, and you don't have the same kind of weaknesses that occur in the community, whether it's racism, bias, it's just not a true reflection of where you get officers. You're not breeding them. You're not breeding this out of them. This is something that you hope through training and also a discipline system when people act out is to show them that this is the right way to go. But I think there is racism throughout America. There's a racism in every endeavor, whether it's an employment, whether it's an avocation. And the issue is, how do you address it and deal with it when it comes to light? We still see in the city of Los Angeles issues that come before city council where you're paying out lawsuits and you want to look at the calendar and say, is this really 2015? Because you thought this behavior was stopped years ago. But I think what goes on in this whole arena of policing, it's a very dynamic situation. It's supposedly improving all the time. But if we're talking today about police officers being the John Wayne type, this was something that 30 years ago, people were talking about stamping out with community-based policing, basic car, all these things were generated. So it leads me to believe 50 years later, if it hasn't made the impact that we thought, either we're trying to implement it wrong or we have hybrid situations out there that we're basically undermining what we had intended to do. Because these same comments were made 30, 40 years ago about the difference between John Wayne police officers and police officers that had a relationship with the community, people that were problem solvers versus people that made arrests as their only solution. Then we've made little or no progress, which is very disappointing.
David, you're smiling. Was that your experience as well?
It is, and it has been. And it's hard to change. I go back and talk about the culture, and it's very hard to change that. Because in an article I read recently, actually from one of the guys where one of the officers here was interviewed, he said that to do community policing meant to become a social worker. And that's really not what it's about. It's about serving the people.
Roland, here's something. You mentioned Baltimore just a moment ago. I mean, is there too much of a focus on race? Because if you look at the hierarchy in Baltimore, the police commissioner is black, the mayor is black, the state's attorney is black. yet we still had lots of protests, lots of tension. I mean, does that weaken the argument
Nope.
that,
No.
you know, it doesn't?
Because you have to examine the department. See, at the outset, I said it's always blue.
Right.
See, you can be white, black, Hispanic, Asian, you can be Irish, African American, but you're still blue. That's the overarching issue. You're blue. That is the police department. But when you look at Ferguson, that was clearly an issue of race. Baltimore, it's a different type issue, and that's part of the problem. We only want to look at it in one particular way. In New York, you have a significant number of black cops, but you also have racial issues there. You've had black cops who said, I only feel safe when I'm actually in uniform. Black cops will tell you, I don't want to go undercover because I'm scared I might get shot by another cop, and we've seen that happen other places. I believe the fundamental problem we have in America comes down to accountability. When you do not penalize officers for bad behavior, then you're pretty much saying you can do what you want. When you're not indicting them, when you're not convicting them, when you're not charging them, that's the problem. And so even if, in the case of, look at Charlotte, you get a black police chief, you get a police officer who kills Jonathan Farrell, a young man, a Florida A&M graduate, played football there, and he was called cops for help because he was in a car accident. When cops came up on the scene, he ran towards them like, thank you, you're here. Young cop freaks out, pulls his gun out, kills Jonathan Farrell. First grand jury fails to indict. The state takes the case over. That grand jury indicts him on manslaughter. It's been almost 2 years before they go to trial. They actually started this month. But again, this is a case where the police chief said, clear cut, he should not have killed this guy. First grand jury said, we see the cop's perspective. And so if you don't have accountability, you're going to have the same problem over and over and over again. And to Councilman Park's problem, look at the payouts. This is where I want to see fiscal conservatives. You're spending millions of dollars that could be going to city services, paying out these lawsuits, plus you're still paying these guys pension, you're paying for their lawyer, and then you still might come back on the police force after you've killed somebody and cost the city millions.
Connie, was that an issue that was looked at? Sorry, go ahead. You want to say something?
And you're going to continue making those payouts because what officers say is good policing,
That's right.
we in the community say is abuse or excessive force or unwarranted shootings. They, the cops, say, no, that's good policing. So we have a fundamental disagreement about what's good and what's bad, what's behavior that's acceptable and what isn't.
And DAs are affirming that, and that's the problem too.
Right,
That's
Connie,
right.
was the issue of accountability oversight looked at by your task force? I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, what the federal government can do is limited because what happens is at local level, is at local police forces. But was the issue of accountability looked at? They can do something.
Yes, yes, of course it was. You can't talk about policing without talking about discipline. And as Chief Parks says, holding officers accountable is a pretty key part of what you have to do to have any police force that follows the Constitution and treats your populations properly. So you have to have a discipline system that makes sense to the officers, that they understand and can follow, and that makes sense to the community. Right now, there's a real disconnect between what folks in the community see as reasonable. Officers are saying, I had to shoot. They're only evaluating at the moment of impact, instead of looking at, did that officer provoke that incident? Was he reckless? Was she irresponsible in stopping somebody unreasonably? And there's a real divide between the population and the police in how we evaluate and assess police conduct.
David, very quickly, I've got about 50...
Can I
Sorry.
say something on that?
Go ahead, go ahead.
I'd like to just comment on two things. One, I think the final decider on a lot of these issues is the community that sits on civil trials. They often get it better than administration and political figures because they're the ones that are returning these verdicts that say, this is unacceptable, what you said made no sense. The other side is, I think it's a very critical situation when we're talking about using deadly force, is that if you get into the prism of evaluating use of force based on officers using deadly force, and you take a step back and say, I'm going to call it out of policy because you shouldn't have stopped him, you're then sending a clear message that you forfeit your ability to defend yourself. You may ding them on the ability of having poor tactics.
Right.
And you certainly can discipline them on tactics and terminate them on bad tactics. But I think you got to have a clear and a bright line of when you are defending yourself versus you're using tactics as a reason to say the shooting isn't good.
Right.